The golden sands of the Egyptian desert have kept many secrets buried for millennia, but few are as shocking as what archaeologists discovered when they began piecing together the intimate details of pharaonic family life. Imagine walking through the halls of an ancient palace where the boundaries between parent and child, sibling and spouse became so blurred that family trees resembled tangled webs rather than orderly branches. This wasn't the result of accident or ignorance. This was a deliberate system of royal breeding practices so extreme that they would make modern audiences recoil in horror. What you're about to learn challenges everything we think we know about ancient Egyptian civilization. Behind the golden masks and magnificent monuments lay a world where genetic manipulation reached levels that bordered on the grotesque, where the pursuit of divine purity led to consequences so disturbing that the evidence was deliberately hidden from history. The royal bloodlines that produced some of Egypt's most famous pharaohs were maintained through breeding practices that modern science has revealed to be not just morally questionable, but biologically catastrophic. Today, we're diving deep into the darkest corners of Egyptian royal tradition, where DNA analysis has uncovered truths that ancient scribes dared not record. We'll explore how the obsession with maintaining pure bloodlines led to systematic inbreeding that produced deformed monarchs. And we'll examine specific cases where the genetic consequences became so severe that entire dynasties collapsed under the weight of their own biological contradictions. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why these practices were hidden from public view and why their discovery has fundamentally changed our understanding of ancient Egyptian society. The foundation of Egyptian royal breeding practices rested on a theological concept that seems almost incomprehensible by modern standards. The pharaohs weren't merely political leaders or military commanders. They were considered living embodiments of divinity, direct descendants of the gods themselves. This divine status created an impossible problem for succession planning. If the pharaoh possessed truly divine blood, how could that sacred essence be preserved and passed to the next generation without dilution by ordinary human genetics? Ancient Egyptian theology provided a disturbing solution. The gods themselves engaged in incestuous relationships, with creation myths describing how divine siblings married and produced offspring who maintained the pure essence of divinity. The most prominent example was the marriage between the god Osiris and his sister Isis, a union that produced Horus, the divine prototype for all pharaohs. If incest was not only acceptable but actually sacred among the gods, then the earthly pharaohs had both permission and obligation to follow the same patterns. This religious justification transformed what would have been considered abhorrent behavior in most societies into a sacred duty. Royal marriages weren't arranged for political advantage or romantic compatibility, but for the preservation of divine genetics. The closer the blood relationship between spouses, the purer the resulting offspring would theoretically be. This logic led to breeding practices that became increasingly extreme as dynasties attempted to outdo their predecessors in maintaining genetic purity. The earliest documented cases of royal incest in Egypt date back to the Old Kingdom, but these were relatively modest compared to what would come later. Brother-sister marriages occurred occasionally, usually justified by specific political circumstances or succession crises. However, as the theological importance of divine blood purity became more sophisticated during the Middle Kingdom, these practices became more systematic and extreme. Archaeological evidence reveals that by the New Kingdom period, royal incest had evolved into a complex system with its own rules and hierarchies. Primary wives were often chosen from within the immediate royal family, while secondary wives might be selected from more distant relatives or foreign royalty. The children from these unions were carefully tracked and evaluated for their suitability as future pharaohs, with the most genetically pure candidates receiving priority in succession planning. The practical implementation of these breeding policies required unprecedented levels of documentation and control. Royal genealogies were maintained with obsessive precision, tracking not just parentage, but also the degree of blood relationship between potential marriage partners. Palace administrators developed sophisticated systems for calculating genetic purity, creating mathematical formulas that determined the theoretical divine content of any proposed union. These calculations weren't merely academic exercises. They had real consequences for political power and dynastic survival. A prince whose parents were full siblings would be considered more suitable for rule than one whose parents were merely half-siblings or cousins. This created intense competition within royal families, where the circumstances of birth determined not just social status, but access to the throne itself. The administrative machinery required to maintain these systems was enormous. Palace scribes maintained detailed records of every royal birth, tracking physical characteristics that might indicate genetic problems or divine favor. Court physicians were required to examine newborn royals and report on their fitness for eventual rule. Even wet nurses and palace servants were carefully selected based on their own bloodlines to ensure that royal children weren't contaminated by contact with genetically inferior individuals. As these practices became more entrenched, they began to take on a momentum of their own. Each generation of pharaohs felt pressure to demonstrate their genetic superiority over their predecessors by engaging in even closer inbreeding. What had begun as occasional brother-sister marriages evolved into systematic programs where multiple generations of the same family intermarried repeatedly, concentrating genetic material to levels that modern science recognizes as extremely dangerous. The mathematical precision with which these breeding programs were executed reveals a sophisticated understanding of heredity that was remarkable for its time, even if the underlying assumptions were scientifically flawed. Royal genealogists developed complex charts showing the theoretical divine content of various marriage combinations, creating a pseudo-scientific framework for what was essentially systematic genetic manipulation. Foreign observers of Egyptian court life were often shocked by these practices, but their protests were dismissed as evidence of their own genetic inferiority. Egyptian royal ideology held that only those who possessed divine blood could truly understand the necessity of preserving it through incestuous unions. Criticism from foreign rulers was seen as proof that they lacked the genetic qualifications to comprehend divine truth. The international implications of these breeding practices created diplomatic challenges that required careful management. Foreign princesses who married into the Egyptian royal family were often relegated to secondary status because their mixed bloodlines made them unsuitable for producing primary heirs. This created tension with allies who expected their daughters to receive equal treatment, leading to complex negotiations over marriage contracts and succession rights. The economic costs of maintaining these breeding systems were staggering. Royal households required massive staffs to manage the complex relationships between multiple wives, children, and extended family members. Palace complexes were designed with separate quarters for different branches of the royal family, each requiring their own servants, guards, and administrative personnel. The expense of supporting these elaborate household arrangements consumed significant portions of the royal treasury. Medical support for royal families became increasingly important as the genetic consequences of inbreeding became more apparent. Palace physicians developed specialized treatments for conditions that appeared repeatedly in royal bloodlines, creating a primitive form of genetic medicine focused on managing hereditary disorders rather than preventing them. These medical records, when they survived, provide crucial evidence for modern researchers studying the biological impact of royal breeding practices. The psychological toll of these arrangements on individual family members was enormous, though rarely documented in official records. Royal children grew up in environments where normal family relationships were impossible, where siblings might become spouses and parents might become grandparents-in-law through complex marriage arrangements. The emotional complexity of these relationships created unique forms of psychological stress that had no precedent in ordinary Egyptian society. The true horror of these breeding practices becomes clear when we examine specific royal families, where genetic concentration reached catastrophic levels. Archaeological evidence from tombs and mummy examinations reveals physical deformities so severe that some pharaohs could barely function as human beings, let alone as divine rulers. These weren't isolated incidents, but predictable outcomes of breeding policies that had spiraled completely out of control. Royal mummies from the most inbred dynasties show skeletal abnormalities that paint a disturbing picture of genetic collapse. Spinal curvatures so severe they would have caused constant agony. Limb deformities that made normal movement impossible. Skull malformations that suggest serious neurological problems. These weren't the bodies of godlike beings, but twisted remnants of genetic experimentation gone horribly wrong. Modern DNA analysis has revealed breeding patterns that exceed even the most extreme cases documented in historical records. Some pharaohs were the products of multiple generations of sibling marriages, creating genetic profiles so concentrated that they resembled those of laboratory animals bred for specific traits. The royal bloodlines had become genetic dead ends where the same defective genes were amplified with each successive generation. The most shocking discoveries came when researchers began mapping the family relationships of Egypt's most famous dynasties. What appeared in official records as normal royal marriages were revealed through genetic testing to be far more disturbing. Fathers marrying daughters, uncles marrying nieces, and complex multi-generational arrangements, where the same genetic material was recycled through increasingly narrow family circles. These revelations forced archaeologists to reinterpret countless artifacts and inscriptions that had previously been understood as symbolic or ceremonial. Royal art showing intimate family scenes took on sinister new meanings when viewed through the lens of documented incestuous relationships. Religious texts praising the purity of royal bloodlines became evidence of systematic genetic manipulation rather than spiritual devotion. The cover-up of these practices was as systematic as the breeding programs themselves. Royal scribes developed elaborate euphemisms and coded language to describe family relationships that would have scandalized ordinary Egyptians. Official genealogies were deliberately falsified to hide the most extreme cases of inbreeding, creating fictional family trees that bore little resemblance to the actual family trees, resemblance to biological reality. Palace artists were required to idealize royal portraits, concealing the physical deformities that resulted from genetic concentration. The beautiful, symmetrical faces we see in Egyptian art were often complete fabrications designed to hide the grotesque reality of what royal inbreeding had produced. When archaeologists discovered actual mummies beneath these artistic lies, the contrast was shocking enough to revolutionize our understanding of Egyptian royal propaganda. The medical consequences extended far beyond physical deformities. Many royal mummies show evidence of genetic disorders that would have caused severe mental impairment, epilepsy, and other neurological conditions. Some pharaohs who were celebrated in historical records as wise and powerful rulers were actually severely disabled individuals who required constant care and supervision. Court physicians developed elaborate systems for managing these genetic disorders, creating what amounted to royal medical institutions dedicated to keeping genetically compromised pharaohs functional enough to perform their ceremonial duties. Palace records describe complex treatments for conditions that modern medicine recognizes as classic symptoms of severe inbreeding depression. The succession crises that plagued many dynasties take on new meaning when viewed through this genetic lens. What historians had interpreted as political struggles were often desperate attempts to find any royal heir who was physically and mentally capable of ruling. The frequent early deaths of pharaohs weren't just the result of warfare or disease, but the predictable outcome of genetic systems that produced increasingly fragile individuals. Some dynasties became so genetically compromised that they required constant infusions of foreign genetic material to survive. Despite their ideological commitment to blood purity, royal families were forced to secretly introduce non-royal genetics through carefully concealed adoption arrangements and falsified parentage records. These genetic rescue attempts were hidden from public view because they contradicted the fundamental theological justification for royal power. The international diplomatic consequences of these breeding practices extended far beyond Egypt's borders. Foreign rulers, who were aware of the genetic problems in Egyptian royal families, began to question the divine status that formed the foundation of pharaonic authority. Intelligence networks throughout the ancient world shared information about the physical and mental defects of Egyptian rulers, undermining Egypt's international prestige. Military leaders from other civilizations began to view genetically compromised pharaohs as strategic opportunities rather than divine threats. The knowledge that Egypt might be ruled by mentally impaired or physically disabled individuals influenced military planning and diplomatic negotiations throughout the region. Egypt's enemies learned to time their attacks during periods when particularly weak pharaohs were on the throne. The economic impact of supporting genetically compromised royal families created enormous drains on the Egyptian treasury. Palace medical facilities required constant expansion to accommodate the increasing number of disabled royals. Specialized equipment, medications, and personnel consumed resources that might otherwise have been used for military campaigns, public works, or trade development. The religious establishment found itself in an impossible position as the genetic consequences of royal breeding became undeniable. Priests who had promoted incestuous marriages as divine mandates were forced to develop increasingly complex theological explanations for why gods would allow their earthly representatives to suffer such obvious physical and mental defects. Temple physicians became experts in managing genetic disorders that appeared repeatedly in royal bloodlines, developing treatments that were often more sophisticated than general medical practice. These specialists maintained detailed records of hereditary conditions, creating the ancient world's most comprehensive genetic databases, even though they lacked modern understanding of how inheritance actually worked. The artistic and architectural legacy of genetically compromised pharaohs reveals the extraordinary measures taken to maintain royal dignity despite obvious physical limitations. Thrones were modified to support rulers who couldn't sit normally. Ceremonial regalia was redesigned to accommodate severe physical deformities. Royal tombs were constructed with accessibility features that suggest their occupants had significant mobility problems during life. Palace architecture evolved to accommodate rulers who required constant medical supervision and mobility assistance. Private quarters included features that modern architects would recognize as disability accommodations, though they were disguised as luxury amenities to maintain royal prestige. The archaeological evidence suggests that some pharaohs were essentially prisoners in their own palaces, unable to function independently due to genetic disorders. The propaganda machinery required to maintain public faith in genetically compromised rulers became increasingly sophisticated and expensive. Professional impersonators were employed to make public appearances when pharaohs were too disabled to appear in person. Elaborate theatrical presentations replaced genuine royal ceremonies, with healthy actors performing roles that the actual pharaohs were physically incapable of fulfilling. These deceptions required the cooperation of thousands of palace personnel, all sworn to secrecy about the true condition of their rulers. The psychological pressure of maintaining these massive cover-ups created its own problems, with palace staff suffering from what modern psychology would recognize as chronic stress disorders related to their participation in systematic deception. The systematic documentation of these deceptions reveals a state apparatus that had evolved entirely around concealing the truth from its own people. Palace records, written in coded language that took modern scholars decades to decipher, describe elaborate systems of body doubles and staged appearances designed to maintain the illusion of royal health and vitality. These weren't occasional substitutions during minor illnesses, but permanent arrangements where the actual pharaohs had become too genetically damaged to appear in public at all. The most disturbing aspect of these cover-ups was how normalized they became within palace culture. Servants were trained from childhood to participate in these deceptions, learning elaborate protocols for managing disabled royals while maintaining absolute silence about their conditions. Failure to maintain these secrets wasn't just grounds for dismissal, but for execution, creating a climate of terror that ensured compliance even among those who were horrified by what they witnessed daily. Archaeological evidence from palace quarters reveals the true extent of royal disability that was hidden from public view. Modified furniture, specialized eating utensils, and mobility aids disguised as ceremonial objects paint a picture of rulers who required constant assistance for basic human functions. Some pharaohs appear to have been so severely impaired that they needed help eating, walking, and even communicating with their advisors. The genetic concentration in royal bloodlines had reached such extreme levels that some dynasties were producing individuals who barely qualified as functional human beings. DNA analysis reveals inbreeding coefficients that exceed anything documented in modern populations, even among the most isolated communities known to science. These weren't just close family marriages, but multi-generational systems that had amplified genetic defects to catastrophic proportions. Court physicians developed increasingly desperate treatments for conditions that appeared with predictable regularity in royal families. Medical papyri describe procedures that modern doctors recognize as primitive attempts to manage severe genetic disorders, including surgical interventions for skeletal deformities and pharmaceutical treatments for neurological conditions. The sophistication of these medical responses indicates that genetic problems in royal families were not occasional anomalies, but expected outcomes requiring systematic management. The religious implications of these genetic disasters created theological crises that threatened the entire foundation of pharaonic authority. How could rulers claim divine status when their bodies were obviously defective? How could they maintain that their bloodlines were blessed by the gods when each generation produced increasingly damaged offspring? The priesthood was forced to develop increasingly elaborate explanations for why divine genetics would manifest in such obviously problematic ways. Some theological responses to these challenges were remarkably creative, reframing genetic disorders as signs of special divine favor rather than evidence of biological failure. Epilepsy was reinterpreted as a form of divine possession that allowed pharaohs to communicate directly with the gods. Physical deformities were described as marks of sacred difference that set true royals apart from ordinary humans. These theological contortions reveal the desperate lengths to which the religious establishment went to maintain royal legitimacy, despite overwhelming evidence of genetic collapse. The economic burden of supporting genetically compromised royal families extended far beyond medical costs. Entire industries developed around manufacturing specialized equipment for disabled royals, creating a shadow economy that consumed enormous resources while producing nothing of value for ordinary Egyptians. Palace workshops employed hundreds of craftsmen who did nothing but create modified versions of common objects to accommodate royal disabilities. The diplomatic consequences of these genetic problems became increasingly severe as foreign rulers gained detailed intelligence about Egyptian royal disabilities. Ambassador reports from various ancient civilizations describe Egyptian pharaohs in terms that make clear their physical and mental limitations were well known throughout the ancient world. This intelligence was used to time invasions, plan rebellions, and negotiate from positions of strength against rulers who were known to be compromised. Military implications were equally serious, as armies lost confidence in leaders who were obviously incapable of commanding troops in battle. Some pharaohs were so severely disabled that they couldn't even appear before their own soldiers, requiring elaborate deceptions during military campaigns. Professional military commanders essentially ran Egypt's armed forces while maintaining the fiction that genetically compromised pharaohs were making strategic decisions. The succession planning required to navigate these genetic disasters became increasingly complex and desperate. Royal advisors were forced to choose between candidates who were all severely compromised in different ways, selecting rulers based on which genetic defects were least incompatible with basic royal functions. These weren't decisions about who would be the best leader, but about who would be capable of sitting upright on a throne long enough to maintain royal dignity. Palace records describe heartbreaking attempts by royal parents to prepare genetically damaged children for roles they would obviously never be capable of fulfilling. Educational programs were modified to accommodate severe learning disabilities, while physical training was adapted for children who could barely walk. The psychological toll on royal families watching their children struggle with disabilities they had deliberately created through their breeding choices must have been enormous. The artistic record from this period reveals increasingly sophisticated techniques for concealing genetic problems through visual propaganda. Sculptors developed methods for idealizing severely deformed subjects, creating masterpieces of artistic deception that bore no resemblance to their actual models. The beautiful royal portraits that fill our museums are essentially works of fantasy, depicting pharaohs as they wished to appear rather than as they actually were. These artistic deceptions required unprecedented levels of skill and creativity, as artists were challenged to create convincing representations of health and vitality while working from models who were obviously disabled. The techniques developed during this period influenced Egyptian artistic traditions for centuries, establishing conventions that prioritized idealized beauty over realistic representation. The psychological impact on palace personnel, who were required to participate in these massive deceptions, created its own set of problems. Servants, guards, and administrators who witnessed the daily reality of royal disability while being required to maintain public fictions of divine perfection suffered from what modern psychology would recognize as severe cognitive dissonance. Palace records describe increasing numbers of staff members requesting transfers, claiming illness, or simply disappearing from their positions. The social control mechanisms required to maintain these deceptions extended throughout Egyptian society, creating surveillance networks designed to identify and eliminate anyone who might reveal royal secrets. Professional informants were embedded in every level of society, from palace servants to provincial administrators, all tasked with identifying potential threats to royal propaganda. The resources devoted to maintaining these security systems rivaled those spent on the military itself. The technological innovations required to support genetically compromised pharaohs led to surprisingly advanced developments in assistive devices and medical equipment. Egyptian craftsmen created sophisticated wheelchairs, communication aids, and life support systems that were centuries ahead of their time. These innovations were hidden from public view, and their knowledge was carefully controlled to prevent their association with royal disability. International trade relationships were affected as foreign merchants and diplomats gained first-hand knowledge of Egyptian royal disabilities. Trade negotiations became more difficult when foreign representatives realized they were dealing with rulers who were obviously incapable of understanding complex agreements. Some trading partners began demanding additional guarantees and securities, recognizing that treaties signed by genetically compromised pharaohs might not be honored by their successors. The military engineering required to accommodate disabled pharaohs during warfare created logistical nightmares that affected Egypt's combat effectiveness. Battle plans had to account for rulers who couldn't ride horses, command troops, or even remain conscious during critical moments. Specialized military equipment was developed to create the illusion of royal participation in battles while keeping actually disabled pharaohs safely away from combat. The educational systems within royal families became increasingly focused on damage control rather than leadership development. Palace tutors were tasked with determining which genetic disorders were affecting individual royals and developing educational programs that worked around severe cognitive limitations. These weren't programs designed to create effective rulers, but systems for managing disabled individuals who would inherit absolute power regardless of their capabilities. The religious ceremonies that formed the backbone of pharaonic authority had to be continuously modified to accommodate rulers with various physical and mental disabilities. Ritual practices that had remained unchanged for centuries were quietly altered to allow participation by pharaohs who couldn't stand, speak clearly, or maintain attention for extended periods. These modifications were disguised as theological innovations, rather than acknowledged as accommodations for disability. The archaeological evidence from royal tombs reveals burial practices that were specifically designed to conceal genetic disorders even in death. Mummification techniques were modified to hide physical deformities, while tomb artwork depicted pharaohs as healthy and vigorous, regardless of their actual condition at death. Even in their final resting places, these rulers were subject to the same deceptions that had characterized their entire lives. The administrative complexity required to govern Egypt while maintaining these massive cover-ups created bureaucratic systems of unprecedented sophistication. Palace administrators developed coded communication systems, elaborate security protocols, and compartmentalized information networks that ensured no single individual had access to complete information about royal disabilities. These administrative innovations influenced Egyptian governmental structures for centuries, creating traditions of secrecy and compartmentalization that extended far beyond royal family management. The human cost of these breeding practices extended beyond the royal families themselves to affect thousands of palace personnel, religious officials, and administrators who were required to participate in systems they knew were fundamentally wrong. The psychological trauma of watching generation after generation of rulers succumb to genetic disorders while being required to maintain fictions of divine perfection created a culture of cynicism and despair within Egypt's ruling class. The scientific legacy of these experiments in genetic manipulation provides modern researchers with unprecedented data about the long-term consequences of systematic inbreeding. The Egyptian royal mummies represent the most complete record of genetic concentration effects available to modern science, offering insights into hereditary disorders that would be impossible to study in any other context. The horror of these breeding practices has inadvertently contributed to modern understanding of genetics in ways that continue to benefit medical research today. The genetic horrors we've uncovered today represent more than just historical curiosity. They reveal the catastrophic consequences of pursuing ideological purity over human well-being, showing us how even the most powerful civilizations can destroy themselves from within through systematic self-deception. The mummified remains of Egypt's pharaohs stand as eternal warnings that no amount of propaganda, artistic manipulation, or religious justification can overcome the fundamental laws of biology. These twisted bloodlines collapsed under their own genetic weight, taking with them one of history's greatest empires, leaving us to wonder what other dark secrets lie buried beneath the sands, waiting to challenge everything we think we know about the ancient world.